My husband caught me cheating with a school friend, filed for divorce, and now demands a DNA test. My husband and I are both in our late 40s and have been married for over 24 years. We have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. For the sake of privacy, I won't go into too many details about us, just enough to explain the situation. For the first 16 years of our marriage, we had a wonderful relationship. However, during that time, a brief and ill-conceived affair from my past with an old boyfriend was revealed to my husband by that old boyfriend's ex-wife. Let me try to explain things as clearly as I can. About 7 years into my marriage, I attended my 15-year high school reunion. Since I was on the reunion committee, I returned home 6 days before the event, and my daughters joined me. My husband flew in the night before the main event. He and I attended the reunion, and we all stayed with my parents. While I was at the reunion without my husband, I reconnected with my first serious boyfriend, whom I'll call Reed. Reed and I had inappropriate contact several times. At that time, Reed was also married with 2 children of his own. He claimed that his marriage was troubled and that he was unhappy. In contrast, my marriage was loving and fulfilling. Looking back, I think I was trying to recapture some of the excitement of my youth. The years of being a mother and homemaker in a secure marriage had left me longing for a bit of adventure, though I now despise my actions during those 3 days we spent together. We behaved as we had in high school, but this time we hid our actions from our spouses and our parents. A few days before the reunion ended, we realized what a huge mistake we had made. We vowed to have no further contact and to move on with our lives as if nothing had happened. The reunion went well, and I even introduced my husband to my old friend and his wife. We all chatted for a while. Standing side by side with these 2 men, I couldn't believe I had betrayed my husband, who was the love of my life and my support. I felt incredibly guilty. Right then and there, I promised myself that I would never tell him because it would hurt him deeply, but I would make it up to him. For the next 9 years, our marriage was almost as perfect as one could imagine. During that time, I felt a strong urge to do everything in my power to make him happy, and I did. I gave him everything I had and made sure there was some form of affection every day. I took care of everything at home and the children so that when he came home from work, he could relax and enjoy his time with the family. The guilt I carried was, and still is, overwhelming. However, I also found immense joy in being a devoted wife and mother to our children. 8 years ago, I gave birth to a boy. My husband was overjoyed to have a son, and they formed a close bond. To be fair, from the day he was born, my husband has been a loving father, showing the same level of love for all our children. Everything was going well for us until one day my husband came home early from work and said we needed to talk. I was worried and thought something had gone wrong at work. Instead, he told me that he had spoken to my old boyfriend's ex-wife earlier that day. As soon as he mentioned her name, my heart started racing, I had trouble breathing, and I felt dizzy. He went on to explain that she had told him her husband had confessed to having an affair with me years ago. She also said that her husband had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of Parkinson's 6 years ago and was now in an advanced stage. They had been divorced for 7 years, which I didn't know. She and her children were still helping him with some tasks as his condition had worsened. He was consumed by guilt and finally confessed. She had remarried but continued to help him with groceries and some basic errands since he had no one else. The affair was no longer significant to her, but she felt a moral obligation to tell my husband. I agreed with her that he should know, but I wish she had contacted me first so that I could have confessed instead of catching my husband and me off guard. I asked my husband for forgiveness and explained that it was a long time ago incident and had no real effect on our relationship. I reminded him of our wonderful marriage and assured him that he and our children remained my top priority. Needless to say, he was upset, hurt, and deeply disrespected. He became extremely angry, which was something I had never seen before. For the next hour, he used offensive language, including disrespectful terms to address me. I sat there crying, not saying a word because I believed every word he said. He had been a wonderful man to me and my whole family. When he finished his outburst, he left in his truck without giving his destination. An hour later, he called and told me he would be back in the evening. He instructed me to gather all the children for a family meeting and to think about what I would tell them. I inquired about what he meant and begged him not to make me do this because we didn't want to burden our children. I expressed that I should be the only one to suffer for this, but he insisted that they needed to know the truth about their mother and told me not to say a word to them until he got home in the evening. I prepared dinner for the children, but I couldn't eat much because of my nervousness. They asked where their father was, and I told them he would be back later because he was working. Then I mentioned that he wanted to have a family meeting that night to discuss something. They asked why and at what time, and I told them to be ready at 8:30. At 8:30, I texted my husband to let him know that we were ready and also asked him to call me so we could go over what we were going to say. But he didn't call. Instead, he arrived right on time at 8:30 and walked into the kitchen where we were all sitting. His demeanor was noticeably different. He was no longer angry. He was happy and gave each of our children a kiss and a hug as usual, then sat down. He looked at me and asked if I wanted to start. I tried to speak but couldn't. I tearfully told him I couldn't do it. He then proceeded to explain to the children in simple terms what I had done. My daughters began to cry and express anger, while my 8-year-old son looked confused and frightened. He asked when all this had happened, and I told them it had happened years ago, and I couldn't remember the exact year. With a frightened expression and tears in his eyes, he asked his father if he was going to leave us. When I heard this, I began to sob, not knowing what my husband would say. Thankfully, he assured our son that he wasn't leaving but mentioned that he would sleep in the spare twin bed in his room for a while. He asked our son if that was okay. My husband explained to the children that things were going to be different for a while and he wanted them to understand that things between him and me might not be the same for some time, if ever. He assured them that things in their world would remain the same and advised them to bring any discomfort to us so that we could address it. Immediately after that day, our marriage was never the same. It took almost 13 months before we began to feel like husband and wife in some sense. It wasn't full intimacy, but he gradually allowed some forms of physical contact. This continued for the next 3 months, but only when he was in the mood. He never initiated anything with me, but I would push things as far as he would allow on a daily basis. Eventually, we began to make love again, but he couldn't do it while looking at me, and the tenderness wasn't the same as before. He explained that when he saw my face, he imagined my old boyfriend, which immediately killed his excitement. I didn't quite understand this, but my therapist mentioned that it's not uncommon for some men. For them, this is a way to regain their masculinity that was compromised by the affair. While it may seem selfish and one-sided on his part, for some unknown reason, it's a turn-on for me, and I eagerly anticipate these moments. Still, I wish we could go back to the way things were. My husband used to be so giving and always made sure I was satisfied, but now he doesn't seem to care about my feelings, and I think he's just using me as a way to get his needs met. He has told me that he won't do things for me the way I do for him, and if you understand what I mean, I somehow feel permanently tainted. I know it's bizarre, but that's the way it's been. I've gotten used to it over the last 3 years and accepted it as our new normal. All things considered, things were going pretty well between us until last January. During that time, something that should have been a fun exercise turned into something that set us back months in our healing process. The wounds from the past affair were reopened, and we found ourselves further behind than we had been. It was then that my son came home and told his father and me at dinner about a project his 8th grade history class was working on. The project was to trace our family history in America as far back as possible. The teacher suggested that the students use reports from genetic testing companies, but it wasn't mandatory. My son said that his friends planned to use them, and he wanted to do the same. My husband suggested that we do it. He mentioned that it was something he had been interested in for a while. I smiled and agreed, and we finished dinner. We spent the rest of the evening watching a movie, but I wasn't really paying attention because my mind was preoccupied with something else, something I knew could potentially jeopardize everything we had worked hard to rebuild up to that point. While I was fairly certain that my husband was the biological father of my son, there was a small chance that he might not be, given the timing of his conception during Alumni Week when I was with both men. I know what you're probably thinking, and I understand your perspective, but I want to be honest. After the movie, my son went to his room, and my husband and I started to get ready for bed. I asked my husband to sit with me because I had something to tell him. I told him exactly when the affair had taken place and mentioned the slight possibility that our son might not be his biological child. He buried his face in his hands and then shot an angry glare at me. I wasn't sure what he was going to do next. He packed a bag, grabbed his shaving kit, and left. I asked him to stay and discuss it. I didn't want to alarm my son about what was happening, so I let my husband leave without resistance. I called and texted him, but he didn't respond until the next morning when he called to say he was coming home to talk. I felt a sense of relief and believed that we could work through this, given all that we had been through and the progress we had made. When he walked through the door, I grabbed him and asked him to look into my eyes. He hesitated, but I held him. Eventually, he looked at me a little frustrated. I told him, "You are the only man I've ever loved. I would do anything for you, and you know that." Then I explained that I was 99% sure that he was the biological father of our son and that I was only telling him so that he would be aware of the small risk he was taking. He asked if I was done and then said, "Why didn't you tell me this 4 years ago when I found out about your affair? Or rather, why didn't you tell me this 13 years ago, right after you had the affair? Or better yet, why didn't you just not cheat with your old boyfriend and be a decent wife to me and a good mother to your children?" This broke me, and I cried. I said I would change things if I could, but I couldn't. I could only control my actions from now on. He then explained what would happen next. He said the whole family would be taking ancestry tests, and if our son's test came back negative, he would be the one to tell him. Then he would divorce me, and I would give him full custody of our son, which I agreed to. But I told him that I was confident that he was the father of our son. I also asked if we could still share our bed and continue our relationship where we left off. He refused and said I would have to sleep on the pull-out couch in our bedroom for now. I was disappointed but accepted it since at least he was still willing to be in the same room with me. We all took the ancestry tests, and thankfully, the results showed that my husband was indeed the father of our son. After getting the results, my husband helped our son complete his class project. I was relieved and thought things would go back to the way they had been, but they didn't. I'm still sleeping on the couch, and my husband has become distant. He only spends time with me when our son is around or when our daughters are home. He has also joined a local hiking club as vice president, so most evenings, after dinner, if he's not with our son, he's out hiking with the club or working with the board. This has been going on for almost 4 months, and I'm feeling lonely and left out. I want my husband back the way he used to be before he found out about my affair. Any suggestions on what I could do, in addition to what I'm already doing? As I mentioned earlier in this post, I've done everything I can think of for him, but I haven't been able to break through his emotional barriers. I know he'll never forget what I've done and may never forgive me, but I'm willing to accept that as long as we can return to the love and mutual admiration we once had for each other. My feelings for him are stronger than ever, but I fear that he has fallen out of love with me. Situation update, I'll get back to you quickly. First, let me answer some common questions. Question: my old boyfriend and I dated for most of high school. I ended the relationship shortly after college because the long-distance situation didn't work for us. Second question: I reconnected with him when I returned home. I was on the reunion committee, and we had a list of names to call and confirm attendance. I deliberately picked the list with his name on it, so you could say that I initiated contact. After it happened, I felt a terrible guilt that, in a way, made me a better person. Third question: my husband never pressured me to do anything. I've done everything willingly with him, and most of the time, I've taken the initiative. Although I wish he'd hold me and show me affection the way he did before, I've accepted our new life. I appreciate any attention he gives me. If he's happy, I'm happy. Fourth question: my husband has never cheated on me. I'm sure of this because his focus has always been 100% on his family. He is a good man, an excellent father, and the rock of our family. Although our relationship has changed, I'm sure most women here would envy what I have and would gladly trade places with me. Update 7 months after the original post. Hello everyone, I'm here to give you a quick update on the current status of my relationship with my husband. Sadly, as I type this, my husband has decided that he wants a divorce. I am filled with sadness, grief, and regret. These have been my overwhelming feelings since he told me of his decision a month and a half ago. I did everything I could to try to change his mind, but he had already made up his mind. He explained that the last 5 years had been miserable for him, and he assumed they must have been hard for me too. I told him that I wasn't miserable and that just being around him brought me joy. I begged him to reconsider, but it was clear his decision was final. He expressed his desire to start a new life for himself and hoped that I would do the same. He thanked me for the years before the affair, for my efforts in trying to save our marriage, despite my unfaithfulness. He acknowledged that I had been a great mother and wanted us to stay close and co-parent well after the divorce. For the sake of our children, we're handling things amicably out of the courtroom. So the legal process will be more of a formality. We have such a good relationship that even his lawyer asked if we were sure. I expressed my reluctance to get a divorce, but I respect my husband's decision. Everything should be finalized within the next year. One of the most difficult things will be selling the family home we built together, the place where we conceived and raised our children. While we'll both get a substantial amount from the sale, real estate prices in the area have increased so much that I wouldn't be able to afford a new one on my own. I'm currently looking for a new home. My husband has similar plans but wants to buy a place possibly closer to where he works. Our kids are handling it well. My son has been incredibly supportive, he's really been a pillar of strength. Having him around has helped me through some really tough times. My daughters have been supportive too, but they're both busy with school and don't come home that often. I'm planning to start looking for a job later this year, but for now, I'm taking a few months off to focus on self-improvement. Over the past 5 years, the stress in my life has taken a toll on me, leading to some weight gain. My doctor warned me about high blood pressure due to my weight. I don't turn to alcohol, but I use food as a way to cope when I'm under stress. Without my husband around to encourage me, I don't exercise or eat healthily, which has caused me to gain a lot of weight. Lately, my goal is to get back to the weight I was when we got married. In closing, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone for the thoughtful comments and concern for my well-being. I never thought my life would be so interesting, but apparently, it is. Please don't feel sorry for me. I'm fine, the darkest days are behind me, and I'm moving toward a brighter future. Who knows, maybe my husband might change his mind or come back to me in the future. Another story. Grateful? Alright, that was a story. Now let's move on to another one. Stay tuned, and let's dive into it. Also, if I could give one piece of advice regarding divorce, it would be not to pursue it under normal circumstances. In my case, there was no major offense. We were together for 8 years, most of which were good, and we have 4 kids. At the 5-year mark, I got a promotion. I started to think that my ex-husband was somehow holding me back from having more success and a better life. We didn't have a lot of money, but with my new job, I was now earning more than he was. I started working longer hours, while his hours were reduced so he could spend more time at home. I started to resent him for being home and having the opportunity to spend time with our children most evenings. When I got home, the kids were either getting ready for bed or already asleep. After a few months in my new job, I realized that things weren't going well at home when I wasn't there. Some nights, the dishes weren't done when I got home, or the kids hadn't eaten, and I would find something to get mad at him about. No matter what it was, he would always say that he would try harder, but he would also mention how hard it was to be home all the time, which made me even angrier. Over the next couple of years, things continued to get worse. My hours remained long, and his job was only sporadically full-time. There was never a good time for him to work full-time given my schedule, but we needed the money. So whenever he mentioned that he could work extra hours, I would complain. The fewer hours he worked, the more I would complain that he wasn't making enough money. When he pointed out the inconsistency, I would tell him to figure it out. I knew it bothered him, so I started saying it a lot. I used it as an excuse for a lot of things. I really resented him and withdrew from the relationship. I understood that my actions were hurting him, but I didn't care. I believed that if he wanted to avoid being hurt, he should at least try to make me happy. I used this justification when I started dating another man at work. At first, I thought of him as just a friend, but our conversations at work turned into text messages at home. These messages then led to exchanging pictures and videos, and eventually, we started to find ways to spend time alone together. I knew it was wrong, but it made me feel alive, which my husband hadn't made me feel in years. I was tired of being unhappy, and I was doing it for myself. The worst moment was when I came home at a reasonable hour and discovered that he had cleaned the entire house, prepared dinner for the family, and picked out a movie for all of us to watch together. A few years earlier, this would have delighted me, but that night, I couldn't even fake a smile. I pretended to be sick. I spent the entire evening in bed while he waited on me, checked on me, and even brought me food in bed. It made me feel guilty, and then I got angry that he made me feel that way. From that night on, it didn't matter what he did, he seemed wrong just for existing. Most days, he would get so upset about how I treated him, and I would deliberately provoke him to lose his temper. I knew it would happen sooner or later. After most of our fights, he would apologize for something I told him he had done wrong. if there was anything at all. I never apologized. Instead, I often found a way to make him feel worse. I believed that I was right because he was wrong, and that was all I cared about. I even pretended not to care when he found out about my relationship with the guy from work. It hurt me inside to see him in tears, but I wasn't going to let him see that he was getting to me. I was at my most callous when I decided to tell him I wanted a divorce. I could almost hear his heart breaking in his chest. He pleaded and fought, saying we could work through it together. I wasn't interested in fixing our marriage, but I mostly ended things with the other guy, only because I knew I could go back to him if I wanted to. I could see that he was trying, and occasionally I would acknowledge that, but most of the time, I was unbelievably hard on him for every reason I could think of. I'm not sure what else the man could have done to make me happy other than find me a job that paid enough for me not to have to work at all. He said he was looking, and he even found a job or two, but they didn't work out. It was around this time that I discovered this group and a few others. I started posting things about him from just my perspective and got a lot of positive feedback about how I was feeling, which reinforced my belief that I was right. The more I posted, the more validation I received. It wasn't just me who believed that my husband wasn't worth keeping around, the entire internet seemed to be telling me how terrible he was. I started saying terrible things to him and even ignoring him altogether. I was so sure of my opinion and the opinions of others that I hired a lawyer, and within a few weeks, I was on the path to divorce. I continued to use this website and a few others to find validation for my feelings and encouragement to go through with a divorce, and I finally went through with it. The process went relatively smoothly. My ex-husband didn't ask for much other than joint custody of the children. He still hoped we could work things out, but I didn't care about that. He was devastated, but I felt liberated. I had the freedom to do what I wanted without feeling guilty or having to answer to anyone. It was an incredible feeling of freedom, but that feeling didn't last long. For the first month after he moved out, I missed trash day 3 times. The dishes were rarely done, and the laundry piled up for so long that I had to do the sniff test to see if I could wear my clothes again. I rarely saw my kids happy. My oldest had seen some messages from the other guy a few months earlier and knew that my ex-husband still wanted to try to work things out. It didn't take long for her to stop talking to me at all, except to express her desire to go to my ex-husband's house. The other children also told me that they wanted to live with him. I tried to make them happy, but I ended up just buying them toys all the time, and the happiness was short-lived. I struggled at work because I was alone. I couldn't work all the extra hours that were expected of me, so I finally gave in and started calling my ex-husband to help. He always came over as soon as he could, asking if I needed anything. When I came home, I'd find the dishes done, the laundry done, and even dinner prepared. Sometimes he didn't say much after I got back, just told me to call him if I needed anything, and then he would leave. He always looked so sad when it was time to go. A few months later, my girlfriend convinced me to go on a date. It was for dinner and a movie, and I was excited and hopeful at first. But during dinner, an overwhelming feeling of guilt began to consume me, and it got so bad that I didn't even make it to the movie. About a week later, after shedding many tears, I found myself on a therapist's couch. I recounted everything that had happened, starting with the promotion. The therapist didn't validate my actions or the encouragement I had received for the divorce. I started going to her office 2 and sometimes 3 times a week. The more I talked to her, trying to prove that I was right, the more I began to realize how wrong I had been. It was truly heartbreaking. I'm not sure I've ever cried as much in my entire life as I did that first month in her office. After spending about $2,000 in therapy sessions, I realized that while my ex-husband had his faults, I had far more. I had done so many terrible things and said terrible things. He didn't deserve to be treated the way I treated him, but he still loved me. I still remember a moment when he asked me not to go through with the divorce, but I went through with it. Later, I bragged on this platform about how great it felt to be free. I was completely wrong, and now I can see that. A few weeks ago, I approached him as he was leaving the house and asked him about the possibility of getting back together. When he looked at me, his eyes welled up with tears, and a tear rolled down his cheeks. He explained that he didn't know if he could. He said that the pain had been too much for too long, and he was afraid that if we got back together, I might hurt him again. He mentioned that he had always hoped that I would realize how much he loved me, right until the moment I signed the divorce papers, and he let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. He confessed that this had hurt him more than anything and that he wasn't sure he could ever trust me again. Believe me, I don't blame him. I essentially broke a man who, in retrospect, was a great husband. I robbed my children of having a wonderful father at home and took his children away from him. As for myself, the one who sought divorce in search of happiness, I now spend most of my free time either at home or on a therapist's couch. Please do not rely solely on the advice of anyone on this website or anywhere else. If your marriage is going through a rough patch, start by looking at yourself and consider making changes. This advice is for both men and women. Divorce is not fun, and life after divorce is not a walk in the park. Watching your husband broken and your children permanently unhappy because of your actions is one of the most painful experiences I can imagine. I wish you all the best and hope that you'll give your marriages a second chance.